how rare it is to be in the physical presence of one of those who will be talked about and written about 100, 200, 300 years from now. We salute the one and only inimitable Toni Morrison. Indeed. We've have friends who come from all around the world. I look out and see Felicia Rashad, the first winner of the Tony Award, person of African American descent, playing Big Mama in that classic by Lorraine Hansberry of 1959, Raisin in the Sun. She was just here at Princeton, Gem of the Ocean, the magnificent role of the late August Wilson. It's been almost exactly a year. He died October 2nd, 2005. And of course, many know her as the mother of America, the mother of black America, with Brother Bill Cosby. Where is Sister Felicia Rashad? Just raise your hand. Let's give her a hand, please. Absolutely. So many friends. See Brother Toby Sanders there, my dear brother, struggling in Trenton as a public intellectual. Always a blessing, brother. Professor Paula Mann with her beloved family, her mother and her children and brother. Driven a long way to be here. I salute each and every one of you. And I think of Toni Morrison's work, I think of that wonderful line in that minor classic of the indescribable poet, playwright William Shakespeare. His play, King John. It's a play that's rarely read. I hope I can encourage some undergrads to steal away to the library tomorrow and take a peek at it. There's a line that in some ways echoes Shakespeare himself. We know Shakespeare, like Plato, never reveals himself. We really never know what voice he actually adopts as his own. Many scholars have reached the conclusion that this line has everything to do with his own vocation. It is sweet, sweet, sweet poison for the age's tooth. Sweet, sweet, sweet poison for the age's truth. It's spoken by a bastard, Philip Falconbridge. And there's another line in that poem that says, commodity, the bias of the world. And he pits the bastard, deracinated, rootless, in quest for home, in quest for identity, over against a corrupt cardinal. It reminds you a little bit of the market spirituality and Chamber of Commerce, religion, and prosperity gospel so pervasive these days. And the king. I think not just Toni Morrison's work, but I think what I tried to allude to yesterday in talking about the gifts of this particular slice of humanity, people of African descent, standing with dignity, taking action with such courage and compassion, with malice toward none, but with a righteous indignation against injustice, trying to empower those Sly Stone called everyday people, thoroughly democratic. Those three gifts: Socratic questioning on the one hand, prophetic witness for love and justice on the other, and then the tragic comic hope, that dark laughter that hides and conceals tears, psychic scars, and personal bruises, ontological wounds. I say it is a blessing to be here at Princeton to try to hold up this bloodstained banner. As you recall, last night I ended on the word maturity. I was echoing that of the great F.O. Matheson, the towering Harvard professor, for me one of the great public intellectuals in the history of the American empire in the 20th century. I mentioned he committed suicide in 1950. He had already written a classic on American Renaissance and those towering American writers of Whitman Emerson, Melville. But he said, would America be unique among modern nations to move from perceived innocence to corruption without a mediating stage of maturity? That's where I ended yesterday. And that's where I want to begin today, wrestling with this question of ways in which people of African descent in the United States has forged forms of maturity, what I call paideia, P-A-I-D-E-I-A, paideia, democratic forms of paideia in the face of American terrorism. What I was alluding to yesterday is niggerization, ways in which black people constructed as niggers, taught to be fearful, taught to be afraid, subject to manipulation, gullible. It's easy to sell out because you feel as if there's no options or alternatives. And then I was suggesting, of course, that this context of social death, American slavery, the violence, the naked force and coercion, the natal alienation, which I didn't get a chance to talk about too much, but what it really means to be born without access to your ascending or descending generations, what it means to be born without connection with your progeny, your predecessors, what it means to be born as a geological isolate and as a secular excommunicate, to use the language of Orlando Patterson again. Alienated at birth and then dishonored, taught to hate one's self. I alluded to it very briefly in the question and answer yesterday. You see. So that social death that then moves into the civic death of Jim and Jane Crow and so on, the terrorism. Connected to psychic death and spiritual death, all as challenges. And then I suggested, of course, that since 9/11, we all feel unsafe, unprotected, subject to random violence, and hated for who we are, that the whole nation has become niggerized in a particular way. And when I look at the American people, I see American citizens being constituted the way niggers once were. Intimidated, fearful, subject to manipulation, lied to, and if you oppose the lie, you are called a liar. Under control and surveillance, and if you resist the control and surveillance, you become the traitor. Mechanisms of torture. You critique the torture, you become unpatriotic. And black folks say, been here before. Heard this kind of language before. And of course, I highlighted two grand moments that I hope we never forget as a people in this very fragile experiment called democracy, given our tilt toward xenophobia, excessive tilt toward class privilege, tilt toward white supremacy, male supremacy, anti-Semitism, anti-Arab sensibility, trying to hold on to the best of what the American tradition is all about. And I said, there's a Matilda's mother that says, she doesn't have to read George Bernard Shaw's play to know that hatred is a coward's revenge against those who intimidate you. So therefore, when she looks at her baby, she says, what? I don't have a minute to hate. I'll pursue justice for the rest of my life. What does Martin King say? Love, justice. Is that pure naivete? Is that just a refusal to come to terms with reality? Or is something deeper going on? And that's why anytime we talk about race in America, we're really talking about both a vicious legacy of white supremacy, but also various forms of resilience and resistance to that. It is a balance of forces, though often an imbalance of forces, often an asymmetric relation of power, but it's not an abstract category. There's concrete human beings who are suffering and shuddering and struggling to the best of their ability, some falling on their face, some even choosing to be gangsters, some choosing to be scared and cowardly, some choosing to be lukewarm, some submitting to complacency and conformity and cowardice, yes, but Emmett Till's mother, Martin King, Toni Morrison, Du Bois and others, they are that slice of black community, black tradition, that stand tall, that straighten their backs up and say, we are going to build on this democratic form of paideia that is rooted in chocolate slices in America, that's grounded in the legacy of those who resisted the social death of slavery like Frederick Douglass and the civic death of Jim and Jane Crow like Ida B. Wells Barnett. And the fundamental question becomes, especially after 9/11, now that the nation has the blues, can we learn something from a blues people? And maybe if we don't, we'll end up losing this precious experiment in America called democracy. Just like in 1861 and 1862, thank God, there was a white brother with a 1-year formal education pedigree named Abraham Lincoln that was willing to sit down with a Frederick Douglass and sit down with a Harriet Tubman and say, maybe I can learn something about your experience, because we have to mobilize all of the intellectual, political, spiritual, existential resources to try to sustain this fragile experiment in democracy, because the white supremacist forces down south have organized in such a way that the Union is in deep trouble. Another way of raising the question is to say that now that we all have been terrorized, can we learn something from black veterans of American terrorism? Now that we all have been shaken from the light, that hotel civilization I alluded to last night, Henry James talked about, escaping from the darkness. Maybe we can learn something now from a people who've had to grope in darkness. It reminds me, actually, Tony, of the prologue of Richard Wright's great text, Black Boy. Job 5:14. We meet in darkness at daytime. We grope in noonday as in the night. People who could never experience the lights on in the hotel civilization, could never experience the sun out with that grand city on the hill. But in the darkness cast, those lethal shadows, those specters connected to killing fields and mean streets, somehow these people, these black people, continue to dish out gifts like Socratic questioning, like prophetic witness, like tragic comic hope and laughter and blues and jazz and rhythm and blues and the best of hip-hop. What a challenge. What a grand challenge. The question is whether America is ready for it. And maturity is always about mustering the courage to look forms of death in the face and not to hold it at arm's length and escape from it, but work through it. That's precisely why life affirmation is rooted in facing forms of death. So I want to say something about this democratic paideia that produces this level of maturity enacted by Emmett Till's mother, enacted by Martin King, and we can go on and on and on. I see Professor Hanson out there. He knows what I'm talking about. He's been teaching this for 40-some years at the seminary, and he's got a West Indian take on it, which adds some richness. That's Malcolm, and that's Marcus Garvey, and that's whole rich traditions becomes connected with those of us who are now post-Negroes. Our parents were called Negroes. That's very important because that's not true for Barack Obama, is it? He's not a post-Negro. He's a beautiful black man who comes out of a wonderful family that's complicated. That's right. He got a white sister. He got a Kenyan father. So neither one of them Negroes. Well, we can give a lecture on that right there, though, couldn't we? I'm not putting my brother down. I love him much. I'm just, mentioned before, I'm just looking for more courage on his behalf. But the point is this. The point is this. That paideia begins with what Simone Weil calls a formation of attention. A formation of attention. Ortega y Gasset used to say, tell me to what you attend to, and I'll tell you what kind of person you are. Of course, this is where Princeton comes in. This is where the great center, Stanhope, comes in. Princeton is fundamentally committed to democratic paideia. We're trying to convince young folk to shift from the superficial to the substantial, to shift from the frivolous to the serious. You can't just skate on the surfaces all your life and not come to terms with reality and history and memory and mortality. You've got to grow up. It is a perennial process. It's an endless process. But sooner or later, life is going to knock you against the wall and push you to your knees, and Prospect Avenue may not come to your rescue. Being facetious, but you get the point. You see. And when you look at the gifts of black folk and the issues of life and death and joy and sorrow and heartache and heartbreak, always already confronting you. When your child, 4 years old, asks you, why am I hated so? That is a serious question. You have to be able to respond in such a way that the bitterness of their soul does not lead them to be devoured, but at the same time, they've got to be able to gain access to resources to still walk through this chamber of horrors. That's the beginning of paideia. Something is at stake. Thank God for Socrates. As Erasmus used to say, St. Socrates, pray for us. And he was a Christian, Erasmus was. That's my kind of Christian. St. Socrates, pray for us. Paideia, crucial. Center and Stanhope, serious formation of attention. Doing what? Raising the issues of how do we engage in critical reflection, questioning, interrogation, mustering the courage to think so critically for ourselves that we're willing to think against the grain, outside of the box, to be nonconformists, to fundamentally believe that there's something about intellectual integrity as an intrinsic value, and therefore an openness to a variety of different perspectives, because we acknowledge the abundance of the inexhaustible variety of the way in which people view the world, and therefore we must listen to one another. The very art of dialogue. It's so very important. And of course, we're losing the very art of dialogue in contemporary culture, but we won't have time to go into that. We can talk about in question and answer. Thank God Professor Eddie Glauder stood around. He's such a master of it. My God, Princeton is so blessed to have him and to see his blessed wife sitting right next to him. Socratic to the core as a young brother. I say as a young brother because I do think the art of dialogue is being lost among the younger generation. In the same way that the gifts of black folk are more and more waning. I mentioned last night about Aunt Esther dying and King Hedley too. That's 1980. He said Reaganism has reached a point where the level of decay in the black community is such that the connection through memory and history is lost, and you live only in the present, and eternal now reproducing itself over and over again, so that paideia is pushed to the margins. And what does one attend to? What do people attend to these days? Success, prosperity, security, and maybe a little curiosity. But no, this black version of democratic paideia says, no, don't be duped by success. Go back and read that white literary blues man, Tennessee Williams' essay, The Catastrophe of Success, after the Glass Menagerie hit Broadway in 1945. What do you have in mind, Tennessee? I'm not against young people being successful, but if that's all they're about, they'll never be able to engage in serious paideia, especially from the context of the gift of black folk. Success is only a means to greatness. Where is the discourse about greatness? You can't talk about the gifts of black folk unless you talk about greatness. Greatness in the form of what kind of human being you are. Greatness in the form of what is the quality of your service to others. Greatness in the form of what is the depth of your generosity and how deep is your love for others. And I mentioned before, when I mentioned talking about love, I'm not talking about Hollywood. I'm not talking about television. I'm talking about love the way James Baldwin talked about it, the most daring, difficult, and dangerous force in the world, but the most transformative force. The kind of love that makes you take off the mask because you, in fact, fear that you can't live without it, but you know you can't stay within it. Unsettling. I always hope and pray that Princeton students leave the classroom at least 2 or 3 times in the 4 years that they're here and recognize that their worldview rests on pudding. That's completely discombobulated, disoriented. In fact, I ran into my dear brother the other day. Professor West, I'm thoroughly perplexed. I said, that's good, that's beautiful. Beautiful. Reminds me, Alex, of Socrates. I go around infecting others with the perplexity I have been infected by. And don't confuse perplexity with curiosity. I have great respect for scientists like my dear president, distinguished biologists. Curiosity, yes. But perplexity is like the 5 howls of Lear at the end of Shakespeare's classic, when through his madness he learned some sense of humility, when the very root of who he is has been shattered. That's perplexity. That's a little bit different than going after the data, trying to render it consistent and coherent. That's what formation of attention is about. And that's why we are successful here at Princeton, here at the center, to the degree to which we can convince young people that you're not here solely for your career. You're here to find a calling and wrestle with. You're not here solely for a profession. You're here to find a vocation to grapple with. Well, you learn much from the gifts of black folk, because you can't talk about the figures I have invoked without talking about a deep and profound sense of calling and vocation. Something that you are so self-invested in and self-immersed in that you cannot conceive of yourself not doing it. The way in which John Coltrane blew his horn 18 hours, went to sleep with the horn in his mouth and woke up blowing. Now, that's a bit excessive, but you get my point. The way Joyce wrote to preserve his sanity. That's a calling. It's a bit excessive too, but you understand the point I'm making, you see. That formation of attention goes hand in hand with the cultivation of a self that has to do with confronting the night side of reality, the night side of history, the night side of mortality, as I mentioned before. Democratic paideia. To the degree to which we lose connection with a tradition that puts democratic paideia at the center is the degree to which our democracy continues to slide down a slippery slope with its materialism and hedonism and narcissism, rapacious individualism, to the kind of authoritarian road that it looks like more and more each day we seem to be headed. That's just how integral and constitutive the gifts of black folk can be. That's why race is never just marginal and additive. It sits at the center. And yet even with those gifts we still may fail. Still may fail. There's no guarantee whatsoever. The dictionary cultivation of self is the maturation of a soul. You look very closely at the various texts, towering texts. Go back to David Walker's appeal I had mentioned last night. And, that first time that a black person stepped into Congress on February 12, 1865, with the Reverend Henry Highland Garnett, the pastor of 15th Street Presbyterian Church, and stood before the Congress. First time a black person ever spoke in Congress. And what was the subject matter? Let the monster perish. Speaking to the 13th, 14th Amendments. Monster perish, what are you talking about? It's an acknowledgement that the democratic paideia I'm talking about is always against the backdrop of the catastrophic, the monstrous, the scandalous, the traumatic. That's precisely why one's whole mind, heart, and soul is invested in the education, the paideia process. But that's also precisely why it's never just about information. It's also about transformation. It's not just about perspiring, but it's also about being inspired. It's impossible to actually tease out any of the figures that I've noted before. You can't even begin to pick up a text by Toni Morrison, be it about the Breedlove family in the Bluest Isle, or be it about Pilate and Song of Solomon, without being both unsettled but also inspired. How did these people preserve their sanity and humanity? What role did family, religion, faith, community, Gemeinschaften play? How does that relate to me, given the fact that I feel as if sometimes I am going mad, going insane? That's true for each and every one of us, not just a matter of black folk. Not at all. This issue of democratic paideia that ushers forth out of the black struggle for freedom is an intellectual challenge. It's a beautiful thing that Professor Melissa Harris-Lacewell mentioned this point to me, and she's absolutely right when she read what President Tillman had to say. It's a nice thing to have a president who gives the intellectual defense of the study of black doings and suffering so people can see that it's not PR, it is essential to the mission of the institution. That's hard to find. You can give the sister a hand, give her another hand. That's hard to find. Very hard to find. I remember the first time I was asked to go to Harvard, I turned Harvard down twice before I went. First time I was asked to go to Harvard, I sat down with the president. I said, what is your intellectual defense of Afro-American studies? Oh, I hadn't thought about it. It'd be wonderful to have you, though. No, that's not a place for me. It's not a place for me. Life's too short. It's not integral to what the institution's all about at the deepest level. The quest for truth, small t, the quest for knowledge, small k. And the formation of critical citizens. There's some notion of common good and public interest. Then we don't have a broad enough vision. Something is going on here that needs correction. I don't say that to put Harvard down and acknowledge he lost the game today and so forth. I'm just telling the truth. Just telling the truth. You see. But this democratic paideia, it's not just essential, but it constitutes the democratic leaven in the American loaf. And that loaf can't grow. It's going to get stale, as we see daily. And what happens as the citizens read more and more, niggerized, manipulated, intimidated, pit one against the other, divided over and over and over again, feeling what? More helpless, more impotent, more distrustful of one another. We say, how was it that these particular black people resisted niggerization? See, Muhammad Ali was not a nigger. He resisted niggerization because of his investment in a democratic paideia. Martin King wasn't either. Fannie Lou Hamer wasn't either. You might beat her down so that she loses her eye. You might try to push her into the water and drown her, but she emerges just like Emmett Till's mother, committed to democratic paideia and refuses to be niggerized, in the sense of being so intimidated that she cannot resist with dignity the powers that be. And the American population, as it now undergoes various forms of manipulation and division and bastardization, also have to raise up and say, like Fannie Lou Hamer, we learned something from these particular victims and agents against terrorism. Though one was American style, and now we have gangsters from abroad. And of course, I believe, gangsterism is always phenotypically promiscuous, which is simply saying they come in all colors. They come in all colors. In fact, I recall marching against Saddam Hussein here as a graduate student, because we were calling him a gangster then. Then he was America's gangster, so we were not popular, of course. But if you're going to be against gangsters, you had to be against gangsters consistently in the name of intellectual integrity, and in the name of a prophetic witness tied to love and justice, and in the name of a tragic comic hope. Cross the board. It's true for the left, true for the center, true for the right. And the best of those particular black folk, though of course they're finite and human like anybody else and sometimes fall on their faces, hold up that kind of high standard. Well, what does this particular form of democratic paideia say to us today? And it's here where we have to be very honest and candid. I think it's an open question. One of the reasons why I spend so much time with the younger generation is because I often feel as if this great tradition is being lost, no longer transmitted in the way in which it ought, no longer bequeathed in the way in which it should be. It's not just Princeton, but it's in prisons, it's in community centers, it's in mosques, and temples, and synagogues, and churches, and trade unions, feminist centers dealing with domestic violence of cowardly men who attack their wives and women at home. Very, very concrete issues, but trying to bring to bear some kind of democratic paideia that says to young people, please, as you pursue your prosperity, don't forget magnanimity, greatness of character. As you pursue your security, don't forget your integrity, like Du Bois and Baldwin and Morrison. One of the things that I love about those towering figures, Du Bois, Baldwin, and Morrison, is that they're unbossed, unbought, unafraid, unintimidated, bold, and fearless. That's a rare thing in the world. All of us can learn, not by imitation. Emerson is right. Imitation is suicide. But by inspiration. to view their example as a springboard and a launching pad. But that kind of freedom of mind, heart, and soul in the face of the social death and the civic death and the psychic death, as well as that spiritual death of just outright full-scale nihilism, meaninglessness, lovelessness, hopelessness, which is also more and more pervasive these days, and not just in chocolate cities, in vanilla suburbs too, tied to addictive personalities and dispositions, all to pacify a populace as they are rendered more and more powerless vis-a-vis the powers that be. It's a fundamental commitment to the sanctity and dignity of those the late great James Cleveland called ordinary people. And democratic paideia is about how they can convince themselves to democratically take back power in the face of elite abuse of power. And yes, that third gift oftentimes is a last resort. That's where our artists play an important role. And I think it's no accident that when you look for truth-telling these days, one more than likely has to go to the artist. Whatever form it takes, whatever form it takes. It could be M1, A Dead Prayer. So they got this little brother now, Lupe Fiasco, sounds good to me, telling the truth. You can go to Toni Morrison, you can go to Thomas Pynchon, you can go to Tony Kushner. We just lost a giant, Arthur Miller. Stephen Sondheim's another great truth teller. Go to the artists. The professors, brilliant, smart, sophisticated, refined. How much courage? Always a question mark. Thank God they're doing what they do with the young folk. Yes. Yes, but as I started this lecture, you can't talk about the gifts of black folk unless you're willing to talk about things that you are willing to live and die for. And I'm not saying martyrdom is normative, but somebody's got to do it. It's the very blood of such folk that fertilize the possibility for democratic change and transformation of the next generation. That's why you can't talk about gifts of black folk without talking about Medgar and Martin and Malcolm and Fanny and Stokely and others. Those are just not abstract names. Those are persons who put their bodies in the process of democratic paideia, and sometimes their bodies didn't come back and their families had to shed tears. Yet we never, ever, ever forget them. And of course, black folk have no monopoly on this. This is true for cultures, colors across the board. But that's what we're talking about. That's what paideia is about. That's what Socratic questioning is about. That's why Socrates drank the hemlock. That's what prophetic witness is about. That's why Jesus ended up on the cross. That's what tragic comic hope and dark laughter is about. If we reach the point where the only way we can take back power is to raise our voices in such a way and stylize time by means of our bodies, by walking and talking in such a way, that's what we have to do. That's why we'll sing and cry and walk and dance. No other control. That was true during slavery. Jim Crow, we got a little more space. Break the back of Jim Crow, 1964, 5. My God, it's not too long ago. Not too long ago at all. We mentioned yesterday, Princeton on the cutting edge of breaking the back of American apartheid. No, not on the cutting edge, but we had some Princeton students who were involved. They were involved. Brother Ralph Nader, the class of 55, and Edward Zaid, the class of 57. I mean, they may not be the most popular graduates of Princeton, but they're ours. Just like Donald Rumsfeld is ours. I mean, we got a big family. We've got a complicated, heterogeneous, diverse group of folk out there. They're still Princetonians. I don't push Rumsfeld out of the family just because he's wrong. I just have to fight him, that's all. I just have to oppose him democratically. I hope he's opposing me democratically rather than authoritarianly, but that's another issue. But I end on this blue note. It's a note not just of laughter, but of dignity and defiance and dissonance in the minor key again. And the blue note has everything to do with holding out for the possibility of democratic paideia once again becoming a powerful force. Learning how to live, learning how to die, learning how to die by criticizing one's own assumptions and presuppositions in such a way that you let some of them go, that you give some of them up. And each time you do that, it's a small death. And it's the only way maturation, it's the only way maturity comes about. And that's one of the crucial ways in which the democratic paideia honed out over time by black people in the age of terrorism that did begin when the first dignified African stepped off that slave ship into this whirlwind of white supremacy. One could call it the absurd, but I follow Samuel Beckett. He says, no, the absurd is even too abstract. Just call it a mess. I love Beckett. How do we live and generate art that allows us to come to terms with the mess? Of course, I call it the funk. That's really what it is. It's quite telling that Shakespeare ends King John, this minor play, but I think full of so much deep meaning. He reverses the tradition of Elizabethan playwriting, where usually the person with the highest rank has the last word. But in this play, it's the old bastard, Philip, who has the last word, which for Shakespeare means there's a sense in which he is the real king, but he's the king of magnanimity. He's the king of integrity. He's the king of greatness, even though the king of success and prosperity and power still reigns. Let us hope that some of the wise words and lives of this great and grand tradition of struggle for black freedom has at least a last word as we proceed. Thank you all so very much. Appreciate it. Very patient. I appreciate that. We've got good time for questions, queries, commentary. Do not hesitate. It's so kind of you all to come back on a Saturday night like this. So I think we do have microphones, right? I think it's brother with the Princeton shirt on, right in the middle there. Good to see you. But you just stand up and make sure everyone can hear you, though, brother. Inspiration of hope. Yeah, I appreciate the question. One is that, you see, I have a fundamental dedication to the three dimensions of time, the past, present, and the future. And so I begin with the past. I begin with piety. By piety, we mean paying debts to those who came before and the sources of your movement from womb to tomb as a force of goodness in your life. So I began with my mama, basically. I mean, that's really what I want to say. It begins with mom and dad, you know. Last night when I began invoking Toni Morrison's blessed parents, because it begins with persons who provide a certain kind of unconditional love for you, a love that you know in the sense you really don't deserve. It's a sheer act of grace. It's almost a kind of, I mean, W.H. Auden has this wonderful definition of agape as that eros mutated by grace. So it's not just an addition, it's a conversion that allows you to have wind at your back. So I could not downplay the role of mom and dad or my brother Clifton and two sisters, and even my kids. It'd be true for Clifton, my son, as well as my beloved daughter, Zaytun. So that it's very much family, and then from there goes the friends, like Brother Eddie, Tavis Smiley, Toni Morrison, and on and on. You know, we'll enter a close circle of friends. And then from there it goes to my conversation with the dead. And I tend to be in continual conversation with Chekhov. He speaks to me regularly. Absolutely. There's a short story you'd probably want to read called Rothschild's Fiddle. You read that tonight or tomorrow, brother. It's a hell of a text. And it illuminates some of what I'm talking about today, the relation between music and death. It's a blues story, even though Chekhov's is Russian, you know. It's blues to the core. And of course, you're in my class, so we had wonderful dialogue about some of that other stuff we get into. So it's good to see. No, indeed. Where was it? I didn't.
Thank you. Professor West, my name is Bruce McBarnett, class of 80, and a question that I had for you today, I was certainly very impressed with your presentation as always, is the democratic paideia of which you speak. Yes. What group or type of institution or segment of society, besides universities, do you see as taking the leadership in providing the resurgence of this democratic paideia?
Yeah, it's a good question, but I didn't want to make any predictions, though. I mean, your question has to do with what is in place at the moment. I think you find it in a variety of different forms in very different contexts. You do see it at the university. You've got this wonderful conversation going on, you've got intellectual ferment going on, and you've got a slice of courageous engagement that spills over in such a way that persons outside not only have to take notice, but have to try to internalize and become part of some kind of motion or movement. You've got in prophetic churches. When I talked about some of the more Constantinian churches, I was just a little critical in terms of the market spirituality and so forth. But prophetic churches haven't completely disappeared. They're just not highly visible. But they're there and they can emerge. Prophetic synagogues the same way. Prophetic mosques would be the same way. The problem is that they've yet to be able to come together in such a way that they coalesce and actually create a kind of space where together they can begin to talk about changing the larger society. Now, my hunch is that just looking at American history, of course, has various cycles. We've got Professor Daniel Rogers, who's written some of the most insightful and wise stuff on American history, though. But I do think that the dialectical interplay between social movements on the outside and courageous politicians on the inside makes a difference. So there's a kind of radical fire under reform. And when that radical fire tends to dampen, then those potential reformers end up well adjusted to a system that is often characterized by, if not lethargy, or to use the language of Russell Feingold, who's a politician actually I have great respect for. What did he say on the floor of the Senate, talking Claudia? He said, we are in a system characterized by legalized bribery and normalized corruption. I said, wow. He's on the inside saying that, right? You can imagine what it looks like me, deep Democrat, you know, radical Christian and so forth. I said, good God, Russell, I appreciate you telling the truth. That doesn't mean you give up on it. It just means that you have to try to reform, broaden things on the outside and work with those on the inside. I had mentioned some politicians, for example, somebody like Phil Angelides running for governor in California, who I'm spending a lot of time with against Arnold. It looks like it's David versus Goliath at the moment, but we don't know. Things will change. Obama himself may get more fire, get more courage, and end up surprising all of us and be a magnificent politician if he lives. You know, you never know, black man run for president. I'm praying for the brother already. Just talk about it. He's going to need some protection. But I think he's a brilliant brother. I think he has magnificent potential. I'm not encouraged when he said, I hear Joe Lieberman as his mentor. I said, oh my God, that's a little bit too Catholic small c for me in terms of who you tie your bandwagon to, because I'm very critical of my dear brother Joe Lieberman and supportive of Ned Lamont. But you're dragging me into politics, you know. And of course, the kind of idea I'm talking about has as much to do with mind, heart, and soul, orientation, and so forth, as ideology in politics. Ideology in politics is always a part and parcel. But when you talk about what kind of human being you want to be, what kind of courage you have in the face of various forms of death, that cuts much deeper than just politics. Because I have a whole host of folk who agree with me politically, but I don't have a whole lot of respect for them on a human level. You see? Because they're cowards in other contexts of their lives. You see them? I mean, I love them, don't get me wrong, but I have people who I have deep ideological and political disagreements with, but they're persons of principle. I just argue that they either got the wrong principle to draw the wrong inferences from the principles that they have. You see what I mean? I mean, like the course we're going to have with Brother Robbie George. I can't wait to be able to teach with my brother, because I have respect for him as a very sophisticated conservative thinker, and we're going to learn a lot together. We're going to wrestle with great texts, and then we'll go out to lunch, and I'll try to tell him why he's wrong. He try to tell me why I'm wrong. That's precisely what democratic paideia in this broader sense is, though we do take stands ideologically, politically, but we may have to clash. We just try to mediate it with respect and civility. And of course, we both are very good at that. Very much so. Professor. Oh.
Thank you so much, Professor West. In thinking about Director Smith's notion of yours as the first volume on what will all become our Morrison shelves, I invite you to hold us as a faculty accountable to the question of courage that you laid out. And so just for history, I would love, this is not so much a question as hoping that you'll maybe riff on this a little bit. How can we be held accountable 10 years from now, 20 years from now, for having been courageous in the face of such privilege and resources and opportunity? What do we have to do to make this possible?
I appreciate the question. You all know Professor Melissa Harris-Lace was such a wonderful, wonderful presence here at Princeton. I guess just kind of stolen from University of Chicago, or you just left University of Chicago, I guess, though, huh? With your blessed little gift from heaven there, too, Parker. I think there's so many different kinds of accountability. I don't believe in a short-term immediate accountability to downplay the long-term accountability. Accountability functions on a number of different levels. And so I think on the one hand, we try to make these lectures as honest, as candid, as insightful and truthful as they can be. And through work with the press and so forth. We've got the director of the press here, too. Raise your hand, though, brother. Raise your hand. There you go. Give this brother a hand. He's been doing a wonderful job at the press. We got the director of the press here. Definitely. He just did some wonderful lectures with my dear brother Ronald Dworkin. Is Democracy Possible? University of Princeton Press. It's a magnificent book, very clear. And Dworkin, of course, he can write some rather obscure stuff when he wants to, but this text is clear. And there's a time to write obscure stuff, but at that particular moment, he wrote something very clear. This particular lecture is for a broader audience. So we say, look, University of Princeton, we will publish our text on issues that may not be that widely accessible to an audience, but scholars aren't concerned about it, and it's very important that scholars engage in their kind of research within their own specialized context. There's other texts that's going to be much broader. This text, we're looking for something broad. Is that right? Absolutely. So that would be the first thing. But that doesn't mean that those who come after me have to do that at all. I do not believe in just one paradigm. I don't believe in one kind of person or one kind of way being the source of all imitation and emulation. We have to make spaces, division of labor, and so on. But on another level, too, I think we also have to acknowledge that the levels of catastrophe and disaster and trauma that I alluded to in this country, not exclusively but disproportionately, poor people of color, that does spill beyond just the publishing of text, so that we have various programs to make efforts to connect with those persons in those communities who could benefit from the center, those persons who could bring insight to the center, just as those of us at the center can bring insight to them. Very important, very important. And of course, many will also be tied to elites, politicians and corporate elites who wield a significant amount of power, who are open to the kind of visions and viewpoints that we have. And that's a different kind of accountability, but it's part and parcel of this kind of collection of forms of accountability that we all have to keep track of. And this is going to be true in regard to, as I mentioned, empire, class, gender, sexual orientation. That's not PC chit-chat. That's wrestling with people's struggles and sufferings and their attempt to be the best that they can, you see. I mean, part of the Ice Age is to trivialize the suffering of others and to be indifferent to the most vulnerable. You know, William James used to say, indifference is the one trait that makes the very angels weep. And William James was right, and he did a lot of weeping, too, for the most vulnerable, a towering man of letters in American civilization. Other questions, though? Appreciate it. You got a hand right there. You say what, though, Val? Okay. Just shout it out, though, brother. Oh, what, is there a microphone, though? Maybe not. Appreciate it. You all hear the question over here? What happens if we don't regain the sense of democratic pride, especially for young black brothers and sisters in urban context? Well, it's already frightening. I mean, the catastrophe has already reached a crisis level in terms of, I've mentioned just briefly, in terms of the criminal justice system with the high school dropout rates tied to the underground economy with buying and selling of drugs and so forth. The prison population, of course, not just losing the right to vote, but oftentimes getting locked up. 62% of them for soft drug sentences. And I always remind my Princeton students that if the police enforced the drug laws at Princeton at the same level of intensity as they do in Trenton, the jails would be more colorful. And I'm not encouraging them to do that. It's just that we have to recognize that there is a differential treatment. You got young people just flying high in the friendly skies across race. We know that. And I'm not for that at all, but I'm just talking about facts. But the fact that a disproportion of black and brown and poor, and more white poor, are getting caught in that way, you see. And I think we end up with a more authoritarian America. And unfortunately, again, there's always the sense that that authoritarian reach touches the poor first. When it begins to hit the middle classes, all of a sudden we got a crisis. Just like I'm thoroughly convinced that, if we had a draft and Princeton, Harvard, Yale, Columbia students had their bodies coming back in coffins, it would be hard to hide them. It'd be difficult to hide them. Because all of a sudden their powerful parents would say, you know what? This is taking it too far. You're going to put my baby's coffin on television. You're going to put that thing on television. We are in a war. We're in a war. We're on it together. How you going to render it invisible? Which is to say, when it begins to touch the middle classes, all of a sudden then that differential treatment kicks in. And begin to say, oh my God, this is real injustice. My God, there's really people dying. No, people have been dying the whole time. I go into black churches, I ask, how many of y'all have relatives in the Army? 90% raise their hand. 90%. Then you go to well-to-do neighborhood. I'd like to go to well-to-do neighborhood. Got friends there. How many of y'all got cousins in the Army? Well, John is a Marine, but he got interested in U.S. history and got tied into a concern about the Army, and next thing you know, he was gone. The only one there. I said, wow, what a difference. You can imagine what it's like if that draft hit equally across the board. And I'm not calling for a draft. I'm just saying it exposes the differential treatment. And we can say this across the board. I was just at St. George's Prep School just last week in Newport. Wonderful place. John Bryan Diamond, who was the cousin of John Brown, the founder of Brown University. You all know what's going on in Brown right now with Sister Ruth, President Ruth Simmons' connection with slavery and so forth. Diamond's a cousin. He's tied to slavery too. You go up there, you got 327 students. You got 200 acres. They got classrooms of 7 in every class. And you tell those young folk, you're brilliant every day, whether they are or not. You just keep telling them, you're brilliant, you're brilliant. Next thing you know, they really start believing it. They start internalizing. God, I am brilliant. I'll be telling you. I thought I was mediocre, but I really am brilliant. The grades go up, self-confidence goes up. Next thing you know, they're on the way to Princeton. That's fine. We want brilliant, hard-working folk tied into Paideia. But can you imagine what it would be like if that kind of treatment were true in the urban context? Jamal, you are brilliant, brother. You think so, Brother West? Yes. Yes, I do. I'm not lying to you. You really are. What make you say that? I just believe in your potential. That's what they tell the white brothers and sisters. It's just a matter of believing, getting them to have confidence. Get moving, be disciplined, be determined. Don't give up, don't cave in. We know it's not a mystery in terms of how you treat young folk. It's just that it's a low priority when it comes to poor children. Now, this is not preaching. It's just a matter of objective fact. The evidence is such that there's a low priority. There's no will among significant influential sectors of the populace to highlight and put a premium on education for poor children. And chickens do come home to roost, as I said yesterday. You reap what you sow. Sooner or later, the whirlwind returns. And there'll never be enough police and prisons to deal with that whirlwind as it continues already to return over and over and over again. And thank God that we do have not just magnificent academic scholars, but sophisticated thinkers and analysts, the Douglas Masseys and others, the Catherine Newmans and others, who are hitting this issue head on. And it's a challenge that affects each and every one of us. I'm sorry to go on so long, though, but I saw another hand somewhere. We've got good time. Yes, here it is right here.
Thank you again for your knowledge. I have a quick question for you. Do you think the quest of the immigration community currently, particularly the Latino portion of the immigration community, is in a way accepting the gifts of black folks in their quest for participation in the American democratic experiment?
Yeah, it's a good question. Appreciate that question. I had alluded yesterday about my being in New York at 9/11 with Brother Freddie Ferraro, who was going to be the first Latino mayor. Just as I worked very closely with Villaraigosa in Los Angeles, first when he lost, and then, of course, when he bounced back in Los Angeles. But as you know, the question is not so much just one's ethnic or racial identity, but it's what is the moral content of that identity and what are the political consequences of that identity. The reason why I work closely with both of those Brown brothers is because they have a vision. They have a democratic vision. They understand, just talk about democratic paideia. So when they stand up, Martin King means somebody, not just as some icon on a pedestal, but that's part and parcel of a tradition they're a part of. Harold Washington means something to them as a great mayor. You see what I mean? In the way in which, Johnny Ford doesn't, who's a black, relatively conservative mayor down in Alabama. So it's not a matter of skin pigmentation or just one's phenotype, right? It's their larger democratic vision. I think that Latino communities, and we have to disaggregate the category, as you know, because you got Puerto Ricans, you got El Salvadorians, you got Dominicans, you got Chicanos, and so forth and so on, all that rich heterogeneity and diversity that category subsumes all these different populations. It's split. It's deeply split. And so you're going to end up just like in other communities with some folk resonating with much of what I'm talking about with Du Bois and so forth and so on, and others who will say, no, that's not me. I'm tying it to some other gifts, not these kind of gifts of black folk that West is talking about. Politically speaking, I mean, they still going to listen to rhythm and blues and jazz because they want to be able to boogie down in their own way. When the right-wing folk can still get their groove on you, we know that. So it's a complicated thing in terms of what they appropriate. But I have hope for building bridges between so-called brown and black folk. I have great hope in that. I grew up in California, and so the black community was right in one corner, the brown was in the next. All of us dealing with apartheid-like conditions and so forth, learn how to communicate with each other beyond language. And it was a magnificent childhood with black and brown in the corner of Sacramento, California. So I do have some hope in that regard. But I'm not naive. I know that there'll always be deep splits in the community in this regard. One last question. Absolutely. Toni, you didn't want to ask the question, did you? Oh, yeah, okay. Because I hate to have Toni just sit here and not say one word, you know what I mean? But go ahead and go. Your last question, though, brother. Yeah, the decline of the art of dialogue and the art of communication and so on, yeah. There's a wonderful book on this to read, though, brother. John Dewey's great text, The Public and Its Problems of 1927. Actually, I think Professor Glaude teaches that text. He teaches a lot of Dewey and James. But it's a classic in terms of how a society tied to democratic paideia, as he defined it in the 20s, tries to sustain the art of dialogue. Active listening, tolerance, a self-confidence that allows one to actually respond rather than to simply undercut, to be self-critical, to be flexible and fluid and so forth. I mean, if I had another lecture, I'd probably be able to say much more about jazz itself as the highest form of democratic symbolic action ever produced in America, where the dialogue has to do with each person having the courage to find their voices and then lift their voices over against other voices in order to elevate the collective performance of the group, the quartet, the orchestra like Duke Ellington or Count and so forth. So what you actually have is this magnificent dialogue, which is in one sense spontaneous and improvisational, but it's spontaneous and improvisational precisely because they are so disciplined and they know the constraints so well owing to their discipline. I'm going to see it tomorrow when Alice Coltrane is in Newark. First concert she will be giving. This is the wife of John Coltrane. 40-some years ago, they were playing together. Her son, Ravi Coltrane, will be playing with her. And all you do is just sit there and watch a conversation, a dialogue, improvisation, antiphonal call and response, repetition, the rhythm and the melody and the harmony, all manifest in works that is not written down. It just depends in part on how you're feeling that day and how somebody else is feeling that day. But it's not in any way exotic, it's not in any way primitivistic, and it's not in any way tied to some kind of natal privilege. John Coltrane was not born privileged playing an instrument created by Adolphe Sax in Belgium in 1848 called a saxophone. He had to learn how to play that. And did he learn how to play it? Dialogue. What goes into that? Same kind of stuff. Courage, openness, flexibility, fluidity, tolerance, willing to be vulnerable, willing to, I started this whole lecture series off, take a risk. You have to be willing to take a risk. You see, Oscar Wilde used to say, sentimentality is, in fact, the sense that one can have the luxury of an emotion without paying for it. That's deep stuff. I'm telling you. I started with Oscar Wilde. I end with Brother Oscar Wilde. Thank you all so very much.